Hello and welcome back to the Comic Lyra podcast. I'm Ryan, also known as Comic Stan. I love comic books. My co-host loves regular books, but I make him read comic books and then make him talk about them in depth. And with me, as always, is my aforementioned Afrofuturist co-host, it's Jamie. Now, just to clear off the bat, I say these things even though they are not him. No one is claiming that you actually are. I just loved the word Afrofuturist.
Afrofuturist is awesome. I've never heard it.
Yeah, apparently it's Black Panther, who we are talking about today, is one of the earliest examples of that kind of aesthetic, because obviously it's futuristic technology with the African,
cool
aesthetic as well.
That makes sense. I think it's rad. I think it's a rad term.
Cool word to say, and I just wanted an excuse to say it.
Yeah, so can I say it? Just the once.
Sure.
Afrofuturist.
Imagine like introducing yourself with that and you have like that on a business card.
Oh, wouldn't it be rad?
But then you're also just a plain looking white guy.
Also, just coming off the way I pronounced that, I would like your opinion on this up the top of the podcast.
Sure.
Because you listen to me talk probably more than any other human.
Probably, yeah. More than your girlfriend.
Well, and this little anecdote is kind of partly relating to her, so hi. She's well spoken. You've met her.
Yes, she is.
She's well spoken.
Very eloquent.
Very eloquent and just generally well spoken. I'm not. I'm articulate.
No. What?
I'm articulate, but I have a Norfolk accent. Something that I've noticed in my own speech patterns recently is that I've started to sound a little bit posh.
That is a thing that happens.
Well, your accent neutralizes, and you listen to my voice for at least an hour and a half a week, and then probably another couple of hours when you edit it.
Well, to be fair, when we're recording, I'm more thinking about my thing to say next. Like, I'm not really listening to you as much.
It really comes across in the recording, Ryan.
And I'm honest.
Do you think I'm getting more posh?
No, but I think
That's excellent.
I'm around you so much. It's like, it's that thing where it's like, you don't notice people like putting on or losing weight if you see them every day, because you get used to it. And then when someone hasn't seen that person so often, you go, oh, you're very different to the last time I saw you. So I think it's that kind of thing. But also there's a thing with couples where I saw a while ago where they actually start to look similar, which sounds crazy.
I hope for my sake she doesn't start to look like me.
Specifically, it's the facial features start to look similar. And the reason that is apparently is because when you're in a relationship with someone, especially a good relationship,
copy each other's mannerisms.
You literally make the faces to each other.
Yeah.
Normally, like modern days, like inside jokes. But because of that, the lines form on the face in a similar way, and then you look similar.
You also see a similar phenomenon with step parents and their stepchildren. If you become a step parent really young and you are like a primary caregiver or a really regular caregiver, sometimes stepchildren will start to look like their step parents. And again, it's that same thing because they are copying their mannerisms, particularly their facial expressions, their facial posture, and their speech patterns. You build muscles in the same place on the faces, and your stepchildren start to look a bit like you. Same
general thing. Basically.
It's the same process. Yeah,
probably more impactful with children because obviously they're like a sponge.
They're still developing
from the world. But it's interesting to think that even adults will do it to each other and still have that kind of thing. So, as I said earlier, Black Panther, specifically Ultimate Black Panther, our first Black Panther comic on the podcast, and my first proper one. I think I've delved in and out occasionally over time, but never as in-depth as we are this week.
This is my first piece of Black Panther media because I'm not entirely sure I've seen the films.
That almost means I was going to say that almost certainly means you haven't, but I think there's like a 50-50 area there where it's like maybe you haven't remembered enough.
Yeah, Marvel films aren't that memorable to me because they're all just the same film.
I think a lot of them are. That's the real problem, is a lot of them are.
It's the same film with different costumes.
Yeah, they might be getting out of it more recently, but they definitely had a formula for a while, and the box office has reflected that. People are like, this is just the same film again.
I definitely feel as though if I had seen the Black Panther film, I would have remembered it because I seem to remember at the time everybody talking about how wonderful it was, how excellent it was.
People were talking about like Oscar buzz for
and how
stuff.
good the protagonist, the main actor was. I don't know his name.
Chadwick Boseman, who passed away, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately passed away, but. And again, I please don't think this cruel. But he passed away quite shortly after, didn't he?
Yeah, like shortly after Endgame was like his last proper thing, I think.
And so having not seen the film, I didn't know if it was genuinely like an amazing performance or it was a fondly remembered performance because it was a beloved character with an actor who seemed to be a bloody stand-up bloke who then passed away.
Yeah.
And that will certainly colour people's perception of things, won't it?
Yeah. to be fair, at the time, people were like, this is great and he's great in it.
Yeah, I know people were utterly fucking distraught when he passed away, weren't they?
Yes, especially because a big part of that was because not only the tragedy itself, but because he didn't tell anyone. But
yes, and it was really surprising, wasn't it?
Yeah, because when people first heard it, I think a lot of people just assumed it was like a tragic accident. And they were like, oh no, he's been dealing with this behind the scenes, he just didn't tell anyone.
And it's so interesting that somebody that famous would deal with such intense personal tragedy so privately in our current cultural landscape where, you know, particularly famous people's lives are a matter of public scrutiny. And actually, you know, it was just so... It was so unusual to me that actually the world around him in the media actually kind of allowed that personal, you know, that very deeply personal experience of being unwell to actually be a personal experience for that man.
Well, he might have just had the right means and resources to keep it secret.
Like, yeah.
That maybe there is that world with the kind of elite, like creatives, actors and what have you, where they just have like teams and people who are like, we'll sort this for you. Like,
and really great doctors, I would hope.
That especially, yeah. I mean, bloody top tier, like elite celebrities, medical history. Imagine if that was just like, whoops, we found out bloody Jared Leto's something weird's with him. Like, there probably is.
There is something weird with Jared Leto, isn't there?
Yeah, he's a creep. Yeah, he's definitely a creep.
Scandal noted.
Yeah. The scandal hasn't happened yet. Everyone's. It's not that he's done anything yet that I know of for certain. I think a lot of people just have bets that when it does happen, they'll get paid out. For like,
yes,
I bet he was a creep, and I've won that bet.
So the comic.
Well, I would say generally Black Panther. A little bit of interesting.
Yeah,
tidbits.
Let's go.
He was actually created back in the 60s by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. I found a quote from Jack Kirby talking about the inception of the idea. Apparently, both him and Stan Lee both claim to have had the original idea.
As they do with every character that they created together.
And I found a quote from Kirby, and when I first saw it, it was a quote him talking about, I was like, oh, I could read this on the podcast. And I read the quote, and I was like, I don't think I'm going to read this out on the podcast. And here's the thing. I'm not going to read out, but just to give you an idea of it, it's imagine someone who has got the right spirit, but still talks like they grew up in an area where, do you know what I mean? Like,
are we talking...
Not any specific language or anything, but like the way he uses the term, to put it bluntly, he uses the term the blacks a lot, or a black.
Right.
Like he says it like that.
Yeah.
But the actual like substance of what he's talking about, to ad-lib very generously, he's like, oh, I noticed we didn't have any black characters here, and there's a big market who would like to, there's an audience who would like to see themselves represented, so I thought, oh, I'll make one then. Imagine that, but like from a guy who grew up in like the 40s and 50s talking like.
Absolutely. And I suppose it's one of those things where the sentiment's there, but actually just the content of what he's saying potentially hasn't aged very well.
Yeah, it's literally that Fresh Prince meme where it's like he's a bit confused, but he's got the spirit.
I had rather just assumed that a black writer had created Black Panther, so I'm really shocked that it was two white men.
Yeah, no, I mean, back in those days, like any big characters were inevitably going to be created by white men.
Yeah.
The good thing, at least, is that from kind of the 90s onwards, probably even as late as the noughties, it became like a very, let's get black writers and artists working on this title.
Yes.
And like that kind of snowballed into like, you know, actual correct representation in that way.
And so when was this created? The 1960s?
The character first introduced in 1960s, probably had some solo stuff then. Apparently popularity waned a bit between then and the 90s.
Right.
And I think you probably could attribute that to this character being written by white people who don't have the references to make him more authentic. And then when the 90s and noise came back, became more popular after then, and then kind of snowballed then to the point right now with obviously like big major player in the MCU kind of thing.
I suppose one of the things that I really noted about this is that it's not rooted in American black culture.
No.
And I suppose the core concept in itself is, what if there was a highly advanced futuristic society in Africa?
Yeah.
What would that look like?
And
if there was a sci-fi city of like almost Starfleet, Star Trek style abundance and human advancement in Africa, what would that look like?
With the added caveat that the reason that they kind of operate in a similar world to ours still is because they're also extremely isolationists.
Yeah.
And that plays into, and there's a really interesting area there of like, and which is addressed in this comic a little bit, which we'll get into, but that idea of like, you've got all these resources, you could help everyone else, but then it's like, but could that risk the people who you are meant to be representing and helping and protecting? So I think that's like a rich area where when a character, like I always say with like Daredevil, like when a character has these inbuilt juxtapositions, that's just rich for mining for story reasons and such.
And the idea of sort of isolationism as a, political ideal or a cultural norm is an interesting one, because there have been periods where certain cultures have done it through history. There was a period where people in Britain were calling for a period of glorious isolation.
God, imagine the fencing that'd be required for that.
I know, right?
Jeez.
And then obviously there was the huge sort of period of isolationist politics in Japan. Japan completely closed itself off from the world for a long time, and then only really started to open itself up after the Second World War.
Kind of had to after then, didn't they?
Well, I mean, fucking hell, like
bit too much to get into.
Yeah, I don't know that either of us are well versed enough in history to really have that discussion.
Yeah.
And again, I was one of the things that I was going to ask you is, I don't know how good your civil rights history is.
No, very broad strokes. They're definitely not detailed.
And myself too. I mean, I think I would imagine mine is probably a little better than yours based on the few years of university level history that I did.
Yep, probably.
But also not, my European medieval history is much better than my 20th century American. But the term Black Panther is a deeply charged, important term, isn't it?
So one thing I did see in my research is both Stan Lee and Jack Kirby do strongly claim to have conceived of the idea before the actual political movement in America.
Really?
They are claiming that because I think there is a misconception with the panther that, because you see a lot of Black Panthers, people assumed it was like a separate species, and that's why it was referred to as the Black Panther as opposed to a panther, but apparently it is just a color variation and they are the one species.
Yes, and also Pantheris is, oh man, I mean, my zoology is not where it could be.
And this is not the podcast to be experts on zoology.
Well, no, but, I mean, we're talking about story, and I have an English degree, so talking about language is a valid thing here, I think.
Yeah.
Pantheris is one of the Latin names given to the order of all big cats.
Right.
So I'm pretty confident that a tiger, the Latin name for tiger is Tigeris pantherus.
I'll take your word on it.
Or something to that degree, but there is some word in the panther root in the name of a tiger.
Right.
And so a panther, I think, is what is the Latin word for all large cats.
Yeah. Well, I think with this specifically, it seems like there was a specific attention paid to the Black Panther, which why it became like a cultural symbol, as well as Stan Lee and Jack Kirby being like, that'd be a cool superhero name.
Yeah. So are they implying that they arrived at the name before the Black Panthers did?
I think it arrived at it independently.
Because from what I can, again, very limited civil rights history. My Black history isn't as good as it could be. And I probably should have done some reading coming into this episode, knowing that I was going to talk about the name. But I'm pretty sure the Black Panther movement hit its peak in the 70s and 80s.
I'm just having a quick look over Wikipedia, the bastion of knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of text, so I'm not going to arrive at the answer very quickly. But it does look like the founding was in the late 60s.
Yeah.
So from that period onwards.
Yeah. And so that's fucking interesting, isn't it? I wonder if the two are related. It's so interesting. I imagine they're not, but
I think most people would assume they are just because of the similar name. But no, apparently it's, again, just arriving independently, like the symbol of an animal as strong as a panther, of black color, that I think that just, appeals to people. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's a very powerful, there's a lot to a name, isn't there? And that is a powerful name.
Exactly. But leave it to Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, two old white dudes at the time, to be like, that'd be a cool superhero name. Because that's probably how I would look at something like that.
Yeah, and I suppose... So how do we feel about the nobility of their intention behind this, then?
I think you got to look at the origins as purely hey, there's an untapped market here. Let's try and appeal to it.
Because I think it's hard to talk about something like Black Panther, particularly for the first time we're ever talking about it.
Yeah.
And not acknowledge what it is and what it stands for, within the context of the really challenging racial history of the country it comes from.
So
do you see what I'm saying?
I absolutely see what you mean. I think we do have a little bit of a cowardly get out of jail free card here, in that the universe, even though Marvel, all superhero comics are fictional, yes, I think with this there is that caveat that this is the ultimate universe and it's a different kind of world. Like the main Marvel universe, still fictional, obviously, but that's more of a reflection on the real world because they try and incorporate real world things into it, as I think it makes for, more interesting storytelling. This is a completely different world, which we're going to talk about as well. But it has less of that real world charged, politicalness to it.
Although in this book that we're reading, there's definitely some tropes of like tribal war happening here.
Yeah, but very different influences because of the larger universe.
Yeah.
So I think on that basis, and again, we're two white dudes with a podcast. We're not going to be the ones to best talk about these kind of things. I think we've mentioned it, and I think honestly, we've mentioned it as best we can, and we're from kind of this point, we're just mainly looking at story because that's our strengths.
Although my final point on it, and I think, and this is just something that I think is cool, particularly within the context of a depiction of black culture created by two white dudes, is that, and again, it may well be that actually, because we're reading it so late in the game, we're seeing a version of it that has had involvement from black writers and black creators, and, I would like to think that at this point in history, lots of black people have been involved in the creation of Black Panther and shaping what it means and what it looks like and the way it reads, right? But what we're seeing here is a depiction of a really advanced society entirely made up of black people, not a bunch of white people making real shitty aspersions about black people and African culture specifically.
Yeah, it's
because that has been the cultural conversation about Africa in in European countries and America. I just remember when we were kids and there'd be fucking adverts about the starving Africans.
Yeah, of course.
And all the poverty porn that we saw on TV. If you're not familiar with it, there used to be adverts with phone numbers that you could call and donate money to like starving children, and they would like go out trying to find poverty porn to fund things. And actually, you look at the African continent, which is a fucking continent and very, very big and has lots of different things in it, you will find the full spectrum of life there, and you'll find the full spectrum of people with different economic circumstances. Whereas the Africa that we were portrayed, like the fucking Live A and all that stuff, was
Comic relief.
Yeah, was of a continent that was entirely in poverty, and that is, of course, just not true.
Yeah. So yeah, that's something that you learn as you get older. It's like, oh wait, that wasn't entirely that, and then you learn about like the idea of like soft propaganda and things like that. So,
exactly.
Yeah, so that's where we're coming from with this whole thing. Again, I think now we're kind of mainly just looking at the story and the writing and some of the larger themes that can kind of take place there.
Yeah.
The one last little tidbit before we get into the comic is, I thought you'd appreciate this. One of the actors in Black Panther was Angela Bassett, played one of the mother role to Black Panther.
Don't know who Angela Bassett is.
That's fine. She then won or nominated for an Oscar soon after that. And the reason I bring up was because there was a joke from John Mulaney at a some awards thing where he said about how Angela Bassett, she was nominated for an Oscar in Black Panther, and he noted there was like, it's like someone getting nominated for a Pulitzer Prize from a Reddit comment. Like the MCU. And what was so funny about that was it panned to Robert Downey Jr., who was in the audience, who was absolutely cackling himself. Like, loved that joke. So, into Ultimate Black Panther specifically, part of the Ultimate Universe that we only just covered last week as well, so we're following a bit of a trend.
But we're just sort of digging into it a bit, aren't we? We're just enjoying being in this new Marvel Universe. I think it's exciting. I think it's interesting. I think it's valid that we're staying here for a little bit.
And the one other one I think I want to do before the end of the year is the proper Ultimates.
Well, I think we should knock that out next week.
Well, next week we've actually got a big DC episode coming up, which I think you're really going to enjoy. I think it's going to be a fun one.
Is Rick Grayson in it?
No. Definitely not Rick Grayson. Dick Grayson isn't in there either.
Is Dick Grayson not in it?
No, he's not.
Is it Bat Family?
It's Batman. I'll tell you now, it's Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. It's their first issues of this. The DC's Absolute Universe, which is like their version of the Ultimate Universe.
Oh, are they also doing the same thing?
Yes.
Fucking Marvel and DC, man. They cannot just stop staring at each other.
To be fair, in this particular instance, Marvel had it first because they had it back like years ago.
Yeah.
But, they copy each other all the time. But basically, we're going to look at Batman built as a tank, and Wonder Woman's like a weird demon woman, maybe, or something. I don't know. We'll get into it.
So they've really gone for it. So, credits are, and this is a little bit interesting here, but the comic was written by Bryan Hill, art by Stefano Casselli, with guest artists for issue 5 and some others after that, Carlos Nieto, and color by David Curiel. Now, the only one of note here is I was just generally looking up I saw it was mentioned, particularly on Wikipedia, this particular title. And I recognized the name Bryan Hill. When I looked at the Marvel website, I was like, oh, he did a Blade comic. And I just had a thought. I was like, I wonder if that's the same Blade comic that I tried last year. Or it was released last year. I tried earlier this year. But I had a read of this Blade comic, which turns out is by this writer. And I gave up on that Blade comic about halfway through issue 1. So I read this Black Panther comic before knowing there was the same person who did this Blade comic. But once I found out, I was like, ooh, that's not a great, But, sometimes you catch writers and artists on their worse projects than others, so that's nothing to go by necessarily. There are 9 issues in total. I should have asked you this before we started, but how many issues did you get through? Like 7?
Pretty good. I got through 9, and it wasn't... There's no kind of like significant like sections that you can kind of talk about, which has been a running theme with the Ultimate titles, because we saw that with Spider-Man and Ultimate X-Men is there's no like this volume after issue 5 or 6 is done and there's a new story. It just keeps going. So that is a bit different to like the mainstream Marvel and DC comics generally. But other than that, those are the credits. And what were your overall thoughts and experiences with this?
It was all right.
Yeah, I had the same kind of thing.
It was a bit lukewarm.
Yeah, bit mid, but good in places.
So part of my thinking is that what excited us so much about the X-Men and the Spider-Man one we did was the novelty. The sheer novelty of it. We were seeing familiar characters played out in completely different ways. Is it possible that we're missing some of what's interesting about this because we're not as firmly entrenched in Black Panther lore as we are in Spider-Man lore?
So as far as I know, because I had this kind of same thoughts.
Yeah, this was my thought reading it.
My general feeling is I think this is pretty close to the normal Black Panther.
Right.
The biggest differences that I could see are related to the larger Ultimate Universe. The antagonists are completely new, not only to Black Panther, but to the kind of to Marvel in general.
Yeah.
But I'll explain their origins as well. But what I did notice is this comic brings the Black Panther character much closer to the Black Panther films.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a good choice when you've got this brand new universe, this new playground to kind of make radical changes, because it's not the mainline thing. And the change elected here seems to be, what if it was more like those really popular films? Because that's the Marvel way and DC way. That's their way anyway. Like when Black Adam came out, played by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, suddenly Black Adam in the comics mysteriously looked a lot like Dwayne Johnson all of a sudden.
I've definitely seen panels from Iron Man comics post MCU where Tony Stark looks more like Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah.
There was a huge shift in the Aquaman comics, wasn't there? Where they changed him from a very blonde white man to looking a bit more like, what's his face?
Bloody hell, I can't remember his name.
Jason Momoa. Where they made Aquaman look like Jason Momoa, didn't they?
For a bit, but it did not stick. I think they just went back straight away to a blonde white guy.
Yeah. Much easier to sell, right?
Apparently.
Unfortunately,
also,
apparently
it's
so.
Aquaman, so like, who cares?
Yeah, who gives a fuck?
Unfortunately.
Who gives a fuck?
Aquaman's the Gilman of the DC universe.
Gilman, we love Gilman. Just sat alone on his throne with nothing to do.
Yeah.
Oh no, Gilman's Black Lagoon. Who's the guy from Invincible?
We didn't get his name.
No.
He was Invincible Fish Guy.
Invincible Fish Man, yeah. You knew who I meant.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's a choice, isn't it? And for me, it helped that, again, not so sure I've seen the films, but I'm familiar with them because it's hard not to be familiar with Marvel stuff because, you know, you see shorts, you see clips floating around the internet.
The reason you might be confused is Wakanda and those characters were featured quite prominently in Infinity War, which
where
you did
I definitely
see.
did see
So
them,
you
yeah.
might have seen that and just, you know, years later been like, did I see Wakanda? Because you spent some time in Wakanda watching Infinity War.
Yeah, because I definitely remember Martin Freeman.
He was in Black Panther, so that's where you'd remember him from.
Yeah.
He wasn't in Infinity War, so maybe you have seen Black
Yeah,
Panther.
maybe I have, man. I don't fucking know.
I'm looking forward to one day doing a series where I make you watch every comic book movie adaptation, and the first bit is just going to be, now the first round, or the first section of the video, has Jamie seen this one before? You would think it'd be a simple yes or no answer, but it's actually more complicated than
It's
that.
much more complicated than that. What film was it that I thought was another film on the podcast? Do you remember?
Thought Hellboy rode a bike,
Yeah.
which I had a realization when I was editing afterwards. I forgot to mention. I think you were thinking of Ghost Rider.
Yeah, probably.
That's all hellfire but skull as opposed to demon, but you know, fiery hellbike and stuff.
It's weird how my brain makes connections. So back to the comic.
Back to the comic. Would you like to hear a little breakdown that the Wikipedia has from the writer Bryan Edward Hill?
Yeah, go for it. So Bryan Edward Hill, what's his deal? Have we read anything by him before? I don't recognise the name.
We haven't. I read the Blade comic that I gave up after half an issue, which was unfortunately extremely cliched, convoluted, and just, God, it was bad.
Okay.
This is much better than that. I will say that for sure. Like, this is a way better comic than his Blade comic.
There's nothing wrong with it, is there?
No, in terms of broad thoughts, my kind of feeling was it felt like it was at loads of points about to be really good.
Yeah.
And it never quite got the momentum going of like a thing it was doing, you know?
And there was sort of this there was almost this central kind of observation about magic versus technology.
Yep.
Which I always dig. I love seeing magic brush up against technology and things. Because I really like a setting with magic. And I really like hyper technical sci-fi settings, and so seeing them brush up against each other was always really fun. And seeing the hyper modern society of Wakanda, seeing a hyper modern, really technologically advanced society that's also rooted in like folklore and magic was quite interesting to me.
Yep.
And so, you know, there was elements of it that I found really fun. The one thing I will say for it is that I think the Marvel House style really works here.
I think what we're seeing here, and I've only one previous example to compare it to, this reminded me a lot of the Ultimate Spider-Man art style. Different artists, because I double-checked that, but it looks quite similar. So we might be seeing the 2023 onwards Ultimate Marvel House style.
Are we starting to see a new Marvel House style almost?
To call it new, I think, would be quite generous, because it's not that different. To put it this way, I think if you showed non-comic fans, they'd be like, it's comic books. But to me, and maybe to you, like, I think we are like, oh, it looks like this other comic specifically that we know is related to it.
So I thought it looked really glossy.
Yep.
I really liked what they did with the Black Panther character design.
I had no complaints about the art at all.
Yeah, I thought it looked good.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the way, again, that Wakanda looked. I thought they did a really great job of capturing a really vast, technologically advanced city. Like, in my head, it's what I imagine Seoul in South Korea would look like if you drew that as a comic book.
Yeah.
Like a hyper modern, really advanced city. And, you know, I kind of got a sense, even though I was only seeing sort of interiors and the odd shot of outside Wakanda, I got a sense of the vastness of it.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really good.
Kind of a compliment and a complaint at the same time. I really liked the kind of landscape looks, like the big areas, big towering, like technologically advanced cities with a unique aesthetic. It's not just like chrome metal or whatever.
No.
But, and had great natural landscapes, like the deserts at one point, or the Sahara, probably more accurately, had at one point there's like a yellow sky, which would look odd in itself because the sky's not fucking yellow, but in this it had that sense of like, oh, it's like sunlight and really bright and colorful in that. And then at the dusk setting in the Sahara, it became purple, which again, wrong color, but it looked gorgeous. My complaint is that I saw these in like small panels.
Yeah.
They really should have dedicated some larger splash panels to like, look at this amazing world. And even just like maybe half a page where, you know, you're not doing necessarily like a attention grabbing splash panel, but just something to be like, look at the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
So like they fit this really nice art into these smaller panels. It's like, flesh it out a bit. Like,
I agree.
Put
yeah.
your best foot forward. Like, you know, I do think in the characters, there was some really nice shading on the characters, especially like the unique armor styles.
Yeah.
Black Panther suit especially, and all the facial features I think look really good for what is quite, and we'll get into it, but more of like a stilted dialogue.
Yeah.
The expressions on the faces carried that meaning a bit further, you know?
Yes, yeah, I agree. And I think going back to the cityscape, something that I found interesting about them is that I only really realised when I was reading this, but I'm over accustomed to seeing New York in comic books.
Yeah, Marvel especially, yeah.
Yeah, and Stan Lee lived in New York, right?
Yes, yeah, Marvel headquarters was in New York.
And so it stands to reason that a lot of the Marvel writers would have been from New York, and so they would have been very, like, East Coast centric.
Yeah.
And so you see a lot of, like, sort of grey and brown cities. And even though New York is a very modern city, it's not a very modern city.
Yeah, it was Spider-Man, I think, that really accentuated that, like, silver, shiny look to buildings and stuff, because he was literally web-swinging past all the windows and stuff, not on the ground floor where it would look more kind of dingy and brown and stuff.
Well, we've both been to New York.
Yes, but we didn't web-swing.
We didn't do any web-swinging, but one of the things that's really interesting about New York is that if you just take it at eye level, it's actually quite an old city.
Yes.
Because a lot of it was built
just on top of everything.
Exactly, yeah. And when New York modernized, they built up. And so actually to find a lot of what is modern about New York, you need to look up, which is where Spider-Man was. But at ground level, New York is very grey and very brown.
It's the difference between, like, just prime examples, Spider-Man and Daredevil. Spider-Man's way high up web swinging and stuff. Daredevil's like, he can get around a bit, but he's like 1-2 stories, that kind of like...
I mean, the geezer's fucking blind. You got to give him some credit.
He gets around pretty well.
And so actually seeing a city depicted in a comic book that didn't look like New York was cool. I just found that interesting.
Especially seeing on the other side with DC, you got Metropolis and Gotham and Central City that all are variations of like New York and Chicago and, you know, those kind of big cities as well. Any city with skyscrapers basically is those kind of ones. So yeah, it's definitely a change of pace to be in a kind of new landscape. Should we cross? So I crossed the bridge between art, which unofficially was starting with the arting. Crossing the bridge between art and story, I've got here what the writer said about the influences.
Yeah, go for it.
So he said that he was invigorated by his opportunity because in addition to his immense respect for Jonathan Hickman's detailed storytelling, agreed there, the idea of shepherding this bold new take on Black Panther in this event gave him a platform to do the kind of broad, epic storytelling he'd always wanted to do in comics. Apparently his influences ranged from the history of the Black Panther comics themselves to Ryan Coogler's incredible work with the recent films and to Frank Herbert's world-building capacity of Dune. Something that people won't expect in the best of ways. Full credit to Marvel editors, blah, blah. But so those kind of takes, I already said the Black Panther films, huge influence on this in a lot of ways.
It's interesting that he talked about wanting to tell a broad story.
Yeah, epic was a interesting word there as well.
I mean, epic is a word that was, you know, people would describe things as being epic in the 2000s.
In a more colloquial way, like epic still is used in like a things are big and epic. It's not just
an epic.
It's not dudes being like, whoa, epic.
Epic, dude. But it is certainly a story that's told in broad strokes.
Yeah. I will say that this is a promotional quote. Like, this is him being like, the comic's about to come out. He's not going to be like, I really dropped the ball on this one. Like, you're like, look how amazing this is.
You know when actors do press junkets?
Oh, yeah.
And if they say they had a lot of fun making the film, that's code for the film didn't come out very well.
I think they've even gone, I think that's a stereotype. I think they've even gone beyond that and will be like, they'll talk about like whatever upsides they can mine out of it.
Yeah.
And then was it like a year later when the kind of dust has settled and no one's making money on it anymore? They were like, yeah, that was a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
Like, geez.
It's like, do you know, Ringo Starr wasn't, Ringo Starr sort of didn't have a lot to do on Sgt. Pepper's.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me.
No, well, the thing is, they'd get him in to do drums at the start of the track, and then they'd spend a few weeks working on the track, and then they'd get him in to do some overdubs at the end. He always quips that he learned how to play chess while they were making Sgt. Pepper's. Because he had fuck all better to do, and he was just sat with some of the guys playing chess.
Well, he made a fuckload of money off anyway, so
he made
good on him.
Cubic fuck ton of money.
Good on you, Ringo. He's the ultimate, like, work smart, not hard.
Fucking A. Just there's also a long-standing suspicion that a lot of the drum tracks on Beatles tunes aren't actually Ringo.
Is that based on the humorous quote?
No, what, the John Lennon one?
Lennon or McCartney, one of them said it, didn't they?
It was Lennon.
Yeah.
No. There were rumours that Paul McCartney would go into the studio after everyone else had left and record over Ringo's drum parts.
For anyone wondering, the quote I'm referencing is apparently they were in an interview and someone asked them, "Is Ringo Starr the best drummer in the world?" And Lennon said, "He's not even the best drummer in the Beatles." Because McCartney was the better drummer.
Yeah, because McCartney's a fantastic drummer.
Yeah. So, enough a tangent on famous white musicians. We're talking about Black Panther. But yeah, so
famous white musicians who stole black culture.
Well, at least we're not talking about Elvis, at the very
Oh,
least.
God, no.
That guy sucked.
That guy fucking sucked, man.
Many scandals noted.
Oh, my God. I saw one the other day, right? Which was like a clip from a film, I assume. And they had a prepubescent, like very small child. And he was singing to her about how she would have her time at some point and find a boyfriend.
Ugh.
Fucking creepy.
Yeah. Let's.
The worst thing was the comments, because people were like, "Oh, why are you accusing Elvis of being a nonce?" And it's
because
like,
he legally was.
Because he was a fucking nonce.
There's document evidence.
Yeah, no, he was an actual fucking nonce.
Right. Anyway, back to the comic.
No, so yeah, the story. The story.
The one thing I found interesting about this quote was the Dune reference. Because I think that is an interesting one with like the idea of these insular advanced societies, like how they're operating. I think the main influence here, getting into the story, is there's this religious prophetic like group who are like, we read the prophecy and we'll tell you what to do, kind of, you know, that. And Black Panther's just like, I don't fucking trust you. Like,
it is a watered down version of Dune, isn't it?
Yes.
Because at least with Dune, I don't remember whether or not I liked the comic.
I think you did.
I don't remember whether or not I liked it.
You read I think you read the book off the back of it. So it must have done, am I right in saying that?
I read bits of it. I picked a copy up and started it.
That's something then.
Yeah. Finishing a book is fucking hard in 2024.
I can't even start books.
Well, we're doing an episode about a very old book soon.
That's
so
going to be a hurdle.
That is going to be tough for you, isn't it?
Mm.
In Dune, yeah, you are right. I can see the comparisons, and I think it's a fair comparison to draw. In Dune, though, I think they do a better job of really setting up the stakes for all the religious stuff.
Yeah, oh, yeah. And that was going to lead to my kind of biggest qualm with this whole thing. The reason I think it could have been good and what stops it is it kind of tries to do too many things.
Yes.
It tries to do the sole story of Black Panther as the king of Wakanda. It tries to do an earlier, I mean, we're covering this issue. We're getting into kind of all the beats of the story as we go along. I think if you haven't decided by now, we're getting into the spoilers. If you haven't decided by now if you want to try it or not, then I think we've talked enough about it.
Should we jump into whether or not, before we get really spoilery?
Sure.
Should we say if we would recommend it or not?
I think if you're really interested in the Ultimate Universe, I would say yes, because it's kind of part of that world. I think if you're really into Black Panther, and again, I don't know because I haven't read enough others to say, if you're a really big fan of the Black Panther films, this is the film in comic form. So maybe yes. If you're a die-hard Black Panther comic fan, I'd be surprised if you got anything out of this that you wouldn't have got out of the proper original comics.
That was absolutely pretty much my take on it as well, is if you are really investing in the Ultimate Universe stuff at the moment, this is a nice installment thereof.
Yeah.
But if you are just going to take it as a standalone comic, I'd probably pick something else.
Yeah, we have picked up because of our interest in the Ultimate Universe, and it has served that. So I will say.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, because we met those two characters in the comic book we read last week.
Yeah, they're a very brief kind of like, and there's turbulence in Africa and the isolationist nation of Wakanda, like that kind of news
we meet
thing.
the sun and the moon dude because somebody explains to Howard Stark that you can only talk to this one while the sun's up, and his friend you can only talk to while the sun's down. And I was like, bit fucking dumb. And then we see them here as the main antagonists, right?
But
so
what I'll say, Fish, the thing is that they do too many things. There's the grief that kind of is a grief of a lost character, which is touched on a bit and then very quickly forgotten. There's what I thought was a really interesting little bit about apparently T'Challa becomes kind of authoritarian after like a terrorist attack.
Yeah.
And I thought like, oh, we're going somewhere really interesting.
Yeah, we're going somewhere real dark here.
And not even necessarily dark, but like morally ambiguous.
Yeah.
And the reason that was so interesting to me is T'Challa is in the main comics. The main character. He's a bit of a Mary Sue in the sense that he's like a kind of perfect character. Because even beyond, he's one of the wealthiest people in the Marvel universe. He's one of the smartest. Like he's up there with like bloody Mr. Fantastic and stuff. Like and Tony Stark. Like talks on their level. He's combat like. It's especially proficient combat fighting. He wears a suit that makes him bulletproof, essentially, without even like taking the force of like a bulletproof vest.
He's getting a bit too close to the Superman thing, isn't he? Where it's like, well, what are his vulnerabilities?
But then even beyond all that stuff, which makes him so great, he's like morally like perfect. Like he's that kind of like, he always makes the best decision. He's always kind when he needs to be kind. He's strong and authoritative when he needs to be those. Like he's always kind of perfect in those ways. Maybe there's Black Panther comics that have delved into that more that I haven't read, but that is the general character.
And that's certainly the gist I got from him here. Because I one of the things that I was going to bring up to you, and I'm really glad you mentioned it, it seems like we're very much on the same page this week, right? Which means it's going to be a piss-boring episode where we just sit and agree with each other for an hour.
No, because then I just start going about, like, here's how I think it would have been better, and like we go back and forth on there. That's the staple comic era episode. It's like, we thought it was all right, here's how we would improve it. Yeah,
so, one of the things I didn't like, or one of the things that I thought should have been explored a bit more thoroughly, and you've already touched on it, is the grief. His father dies really early on, and we don't really see anybody explore his grief.
No, yeah. And what's interesting as well is normally, and again, I'm taking this from the films and what I generally know about the character, what normally happens is the father dies pretty early on in the T'Challa story because it's that makes him king.
But he was already king here.
Yeah, which was
weird.
What's
going on?
That's not explained at all.
That's not how monarchy works.
Exactly. It's not explained that why he's already king. And it just literally, it goes to his dad, T'Chaka, and it just says, former king.
Yeah.
It's like, but why?
So there are, interestingly enough, there are some precedences for this in old European monarchies.
Some people just get tired to like, can't be asked anymore.
No, you wouldn't necessarily see people give up the throne in that way. What you would see is kings name their son co-king, because particularly in the English monarchy,
it's like work experience.
Well,
unpaid internship.
Yeah, kind of. So the old king would get old, and he would be really worried about succession. You'd be at a particularly turbulent time, and some of the lords would be a little bit concerning.
Yeah.
And so he would name his son co-king with him and say, right, we're both the king now. And in the hope that that would smooth the succession over, because how can somebody else be king when the new king has already been king for a while, right?
And I suppose it stops any possible coup attempts of people being like, this young person who's never been king before, we've got to trust him now?
Exactly.
No way. Like,
exactly, yeah. I think it happened with one of the Edwards. And so there is...
Cullen from Twilight.
Yes, that one, yeah. And so there is a precedent for it in monarchy, but it's not really explained. Dad is just sort of kicking about and his son is king. And you're like, well, because again, something that I would have really liked to have seen explored here is, okay, you've given us a sort of non-linear succession. How does succession work then?
Yeah.
Because, in sort of pre William the Conqueror, like really early European history, particularly in Britain, kingship wasn't genealogical. You'd have a king's moot. All of the lords would get around and they would fucking meet up in a field somewhere and they'd decide who the new king was going to be.
Like electing a pope.
Weirdly, yeah, you're right. A really similar process to electing a pope, although electing a pope is a batshit crazy process.
What's interesting is, again, I'm taking this from the films, don't know if it's the same in the comics, but in Wakanda, there is like a succession of family.
Yeah.
But whoever is king does have to defend the title a lot. So people will challenge him, and it's like an organized kind of thing where he drinks a thing to lose the additional powers that they get from like a heart-shaped herb, which gives him like the this kind of the super soldier herb kind of stuff, but they actually lose that stuff, have this combat. So it's succession, but it's also trial by combat as well for leader of a nation.
I've heard an expression before, which is bigger army diplomacy.
Yes,
and sort of being a medieval king. And I keep going back to medieval Europe because, to be honest with you, there's not been a time in history where
point of reference.
Well, there was also a fuck of a lot of monarchies.
Yeah, and
so there was a bunch of kings floating about, and they played a pretty important role in the geopolitics of the age.
Right.
But you would defend, absolutely, you would have to defend your right to be king. And one of the ways you would do that was through combat. If another geezer could fuck you up as king, you'd probably get to be king, wouldn't he?
It's interesting that Wakanda is kind of portrayed as, like, on the one hand being, again, very progressive technologically and all that, but also having these entwined with old traditions as well.
Yeah.
But there's a point where it's like, we can do some really great things with technology, but we're still judging the leadership by a fight.
By combat,
Yeah. But I think, I don't know, they in the Marvel universe, it makes a lot more sense because, like, the people who are, like, more just, of heart are the better fighters because that's normally how it works in superhero stuff.
And it's a hilarious dichotomy because, of course, the qualities you want in somebody who's really good at, like, single hand-to-hand combat are entirely different to the qualities you want in somebody who's a good leader.
Exactly, yeah.
And so when you have a king who's a fantastic, tyrannical bastard, he tends to run a country really poorly, which means there are more challenges to his rule, which he's able to defend because he's really good in a fight. And then when you've got a king who is a bit more genteel and actually a better politician and just better at the day-to-day work of running a country, which, by the way, is just high-level admin.
Yep.
Running a country is just admin.
It's probably similar to running a podcast, like that kind of difficulty level.
Yeah, I would say so. I'd say it's about the same. Yeah, when you get a king who's like that, actually people challenge them more often because the country's just running and everyone's got enough fucking bread. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's the dichotomy between Wakanda as this highly modern country also making use of possibly the most primitive system of governance you could have in a modern country.
Yeah. Again,
I'm saying that as somebody who is from a country that is governed in that fashion.
Yeah. Again, I think it's more appropriate in a superhero universe because good guys normally win the big fights. So, I think it makes more sense here.
But yeah, the dichotomy between Wakanda as this really modern country and then them having a monarchy, it's interesting. Again, not really explored to any great degree. I would really have loved to have seen a bit more intricate world building, and I would love to have seen inside the way that this monarchy functions a bit. Again, I have a very particular set of interests in as much as I find these things quite interesting. Monarchy, governance, the way that countries are run. I really liked, for instance, the Song of Ice and Fire books.
Yep.
I kind of like the Star Wars prequels, I think, for that reason.
Yeah, I that got shout on, but I liked the Ultimate Invasion, which was the Administration, the comic book. So.
Yeah, exactly. And so I would have liked to have seen a bit more inside of that, and I think it would have given us a more well-realized world within which the action would have happened, and it would have made the experience a bit richer for me.
And you know what? In terms of what could have made this better, I think if they had taken out the father character, because after he's dead, it's not brought up again.
No,
it's like a background motivation, but you don't need that because what kills him is a terrorist attack, and that gets focused on more. The idea of Wakanda's under attack. So I feel like they could have taken out the dad character, or just have had him died before the story starts, and you wouldn't have had to. That wouldn't have been a possible theme. But you could focus on the other themes, which I think were more prominent here. Like what I was saying earlier, after that terrorist attack, for a page, he becomes more authoritarian.
Yeah.
But he's justifying. He's like, these are dark times. Like, we've got to, we're trying to root out the enemy that's in the country, kind of thing.
And again, one of the functions of one of the things that will happen in a modern society, and this is an unfortunate fact of life, is that a great tragedy will befall the world, a great terrorist attack will befall the world, and then it will be used as an excuse by those with power to erode people's civil liberties.
Well, good thing nothing like that has happened in the Western world in the past 20 to 25 years.
Exactly, which is why when I go on fucking holiday now, I have to put all my liquids in a little clear bag, and it doesn't help anyone. I have to take my shoes off.
That one shoe bomber guy ruined it for everyone.
Well, exactly, he did. And I would have really liked to have seen, and I think this is what you were just touching on, and what you were hinting towards earlier. How dope would it have been if we saw that society become really authoritative, and we saw we saw a broad strokes overreaction to a terrorist attack as the central observation of this story. That would have been a really fucking interesting story. Instead, what we got was a pretty paint-by-numbers superhero story.
Yeah, and this is why I said earlier about, like, it felt like it was about to get really good at points, and this was one of those points where I was like, ooh, this is interesting, and then it just doesn't get touched on again. It's like, oh, and I wouldn't even needed it to gone full. I mean, I admit that would be really interesting. I didn't even need it to have gone like full authoritarian Wakanda, but just having T'Challa reconcile with that and be like, if I do it, then it's going to go bad for my people. But if I don't do it, we are weak to this enemy, like, and having to, deal with that decision. So I think that's a missed opportunity there, that they could have explored something really interesting. And there's more points and themes after that, which I was like, oh, we're doing this thing now. And now they're not quite landed that as well either. I think the one that kind of becomes the main focus after this, which I can't remember if I've seen in the 8th or 9th issue that I read past the 7th you read or not, but I think it's kind of all over there. The most consistent theme seems to be the isolationism of Wakanda. Yeah. Because right at the beginning, the first opening bit of issue 1 is a village getting attacked by the soldiers of Khonshu and Ra. Yeah. And spies for Wakanda having to leave to report what's happening rather than helping. And I think that's the most consistent theme across the comic, across the title. Yeah. And even that's not as focused on as I would have liked it to have been. Yeah. But that's kind of an interesting area they go into, especially when T'Challa at one point is just like, they're like, hey, we need to go help this village. He's like, well, hang on, steady on. But I like that you do have he's got his queen with him. A really interesting thing there that does get touched on. They sleep in separate beds and aren't romantic or anything with each other. It does seem like more of a arrangement of politics more than anything.
But that's the way that royal marriages historically always have been.
And again, that might be a thing that's picked up later, but is not addressed really here much at all.
Yeah, so I actually thought that was quite a nice subtle detail. That, again, because for me, that was a subtle nod to actual, like, the function of royal marriages. And I know royal marriage now is essentially, well, it's a byword for us getting a day off and there being a lot of crap stuff on telly, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, all hail, obviously. God save whoever is in charge now.
Oh, God, we have a king now.
Yeah, who cares?
Yeah, I know, right?
What's he trial by combat? Come on, Burby fisticuffs.
So, if somebody was going to challenge King Charles III for the throne, which Briton would we put forward? Not a Britain
representative champion, or to challenge for the title?
A representative champion on behalf of the British people to fight King Charles to be king.
I mean, just to make it fair and a popular vote that I think everyone would appreciate, I'd go David Attenborough.
David Attenborough's too old. I think Jeremy Clarkson.
No, I don't want him in charge.
No, he's a fucking ape of a man, but imagine that.
I'd rather see Richard Hammond try and take a swing than... Just for lols.
I think Richard Hammond's quite fighty, though.
Oh yeah, he's scrappy.
I think he's known to be quite punchy.
This is what I mean. That's why I want to see it.
I mean, the one that I would actually want to be king is James May, because he
seems the most, although he hangs out with a bunch of pricks. So
well, this is the thing, isn't it? He's that one kid who would you'd see all of the arsehole kids in your year at school, and then there was that one dude who hung out with them who seemed pretty okay, and you were like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, what are you getting out of this?
You seem normal.
Yeah, he's like a really intelligent bloke, and he likes to pull things apart and mend them and play the piano, and he seems lovely, and then he's hanging out with a fucking ape of a human.
Yeah, it's Top Gear sucks is the kind of main point I was making.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a fan.
I can see why someone would be a fan.
I'm more of a car person than you, though, aren't I?
That's fair enough. back to the comic.
I think Chris Eubank would be a fun.
Sure.
Do you know who Chris Eubank is?
No.
He's a boxer, really great boxer.
Well, yeah, any boxer's obviously going to be all right.
But he's the one who sounds really posh, isn't he?
I'd be maybe sure.
How do you not know who Chris Eubank is?
I read comic books, for Christ's sake.
Yeah, but he's a British icon. He's the one, there's that video, and he's there with his, like, it's like a goggle box thing, like a celebrity goggle box, and he's like, would you like a sweetie? And he hands him a sweetie, and he's like, a finer confection I could have never conceived of. And
I don't waste time watching Gogglebox because there's people watching TV is lame. I watch gamers on YouTube playing video games that I would never play, like a real man.
That's real entertainment.
Yeah, exactly.
Where were we?
Back to the comic. The other point, like story point that I think is interesting, again, not focused on kind of enough, is that there's a risk of a traitor. And the reason I focused that at all was because there's a point where they're having like secret council meeting in like the danger room or whatever it's called. Wherever they call it. And he's like, oh, we've got a traitor, but it's no one in this room. Like, we trust everyone who is in this room. And immediately I had my bad comic book sense to go off, being like, are we about to find out that one of the people in this room is the traitor?
Well, of course they are.
Well, but luckily we didn't get it soon after.
Yeah.
Like if it because
next panel.
Well, exactly. That was my fear. But I'm on issue 9, still hasn't been revealed. Yeah. So I'm happy that even if it does turn out to be someone in the room, it's removed far enough from that quote that it doesn't look ridiculous.
Surely it has to be somebody in the room.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be more interesting if it wasn't and there was somehow someone who is there but in it and not, there's room for that to be more interesting, I think.
There's just one ginger white guy in the corner. Like, I wonder who it is.
Jeremy.
Fucking Judas over there. I trust him implicitly.
Token white guy. So, interestingly, the other little point...
Do you know Judas was the token white guy?
He must have been. I didn't know he was white. I assume the rest of them weren't for the location it took place in.
Well, yeah. So, So Judas is described as having like ginger hair.
Right.
Where the fuck are you finding a redhead in the Middle East 2,000 years ago that isn't a European that's ended up there? Like, it's heavily implied that Judas is the only white guy in the Bible.
I mean, makes sense looking back.
Doesn't it just?
I don't like what's going on. I'm going to snitch.
I'm going to snitch for 40 pieces of silver.
My interesting tidbit was going to be, apparently when they were making Black Panther film, the two highest billed actors that were white were Martin Freeman and, God, I can't remember his name, played Gollum.
Oh, yeah.
It sucks like Andy Serkis.
Andy Serkis.
And apparently they were collectively known as the Tolkien white guys.
The Tolkien... Oh, that's so fucking good. Oh, that's chef's kiss.
Good wordplay.
That's fantastic.
So, one thing I really liked, and I kicked myself that I didn't work this out earlier. So one character introduced is Killmonger. He is a well-known Black Panther antagonist.
Right.
Kind of that evil mirror version of the protagonist kind of thing. But we introduced him, and he's kind of a guerrilla fighter outside of Wakanda in Africa, which plays into the whole, again, isolationism of Wakanda compared to the rest of Africa. There's a great quote later, the line from Black Panther later, where he's like, oh yeah, these guys are meant to respect us, but I only just realized now that we don't really protect them enough to do that. And it's like, yeah, because you fucking walled yourselves in. Like, of course they're not going to give a shit about it. I like the arrogance that he just assumed, like, of course they're going to respect us. Like, look at everything we've got. It's like, yeah, you're not letting them in. Like, they don't care.
You built a wall.
Exactly. But
you built a wall and made them pay for it.
I mean, I think Wakanda could foot the bill in this instance.
Well, you think America could as well.
Unlike some other countries, non-fictional. But Killmonger's introduced, and that's really interesting. So like, ooh, is he an enemy? Like, what's going on here? And then they introduced to the mysterious character who just known as the Wind Rider. And I stupidly was like, who is this?
It's Storm, isn't it?
It's Storm. And as soon as it was revealed to be Storm, I felt like such an idiot. And I was like, how did I not see that coming?
Can we talk about Storm for a moment?
Yeah, let's talk about Storm.
Because
one of the best X-Men characters.
One of the best X-Men characters. I think the most interesting character design to come out of this Ultimate run. Like, if we don't get Storm migrating to the 616 universe after this, I will be thoroughly disappointed.
To be fair, the main 616 Storm is pretty cool as well.
Yeah, right? And I'm not saying as a replacement. I'm talking about a Miles Morales Peter Parker vibe here.
I don't feel like they're different enough to warrant it. Like
her character design, Ryan, is
cool.
Phenomenal. The dreads,
yeah,
like I don't think they're dreads. I think they're twists. If I'm being honest, I think they're twists, which is just a different hairstyle. Do you want to know something interesting?
Always.
So Medusa.
Yep.
Medusa, obviously,
all snake hair,
Greco-Roman thing.
Yeah,
that snake hair isn't snakes. So Medusa is based on depictions of an Egyptian goddess that Greek people saw, but they were Greek people who were seeing the depictions, I think, in sculpture, and they didn't know what her hair was because her hair was afro hair in twists.
So someone was like, probably snakes.
Probably snakes, yeah, absolutely. And I
love someone else being like, it sounds wrong, but I don't know enough about Greek mythology to dispute them.
And the things that sometimes look like sort of spotty helmets that you see in Egyptian sculpture.
Yeah.
That's twists.
Right.
That's a protective style that you do on afro hair. And so actually, like, there's so many interesting points where, okay, this is a massive fucking tangent, but I think it's an interesting one.
On this podcast,
of all places.
Of all podcasts.
Because early Egyptology was largely done by British people that had gone over to Egypt and just started making ribald conclusions, we often depict historical Egyptian figures as being quite white.
Yeah.
When obviously they were in fucking Africa, so they wouldn't have been white at all. They would have all been black.
I mean, except Jesus, obviously.
I
was told Jesus was white.
Exactly. Except for all the other depictions of Jesus where he's pretty much every ethnicity. And so there's all of these sort of things that stem from Egyptian culture where we've just entirely misread black features and turned them into the snakes on Medusa's hair, for instance. And so I think Storm turning up with what I think are twists, and I would love for somebody who has a richer understanding of afro hair than I do and protective hairstyles, which have a huge, vast, rich history and are really, really important culturally. Have you seen the documentary that Chris Rock made?
I know of it, about hair, isn't it?
Yeah. So I sat down and watched that. It really delved into the importance of afro hair.
Yeah.
And the reclaiming of afro hair and traditional protective hairstyles in the black community in breaking down white beauty standards that are being imposed on black people, largely in America, but also in the UK and also all over the world. And so I think us having a Storm here where, yes, she still has the jet white hair because it's Storm.
Yeah. But
it's in a protective style. I thought that was such a bold, fucking excellent character design choice. And I think there are a subset of comic book fans who get really upset when they see a character who has historically been white portrayed as black.
Yeah.
And I think they can go fuck themselves.
Yeah.
Because what we get is some of the coolest shit Marvel have done in years. Miles Morales, one of the coolest fucking characters Marvel have created in a long time, and this version of Storm, one of the coolest fucking character designs in this whole Ultimate run.
Yeah.
I think the two standouts for me that I've seen in this Ultimate run so far have been middle-aged Peter Parker, not necessarily for the visual language that they've used, but just for the dimension it brings to the character. Grey Hulk, I'm really excited about the Grey Hulk we saw in the last episode.
Yep.
And I'm really excited about this version of Storm.
I'm excited to see where she goes. Again, my common complaint here is not doing enough with the thing, and I feel like we're not getting enough Storm, but maybe that's just for now.
Yeah.
She's coming across as powerful, like she's like the was it like decision maker kind of thing of like having her on your team is like a really good fucking shout.
Yeah.
In terms of the hair, I think one thing that's interesting is she's probably got long hair. There's been points where she's had a bloody mohawk, which looks awesome on her.
Yeah.
But I think the long hair ultimately is the best thing for Storm because you do these big kind of like she's flying and the wind's blowing and her hair's going everywhere. And it's like just, it looks great for her powers, you know?
I mean, one of the benefits of portraying Storm with an afro is you get the best of both worlds.
But the afro doesn't move around as much, does it? Like compared to long flowing hair.
Well, no. But what you get is shorter hair when it's in a protective style, or when it's wet and you get the shrinkage. And then when it's dry and it's open, suddenly it's this whole other What I'm suggesting is that by giving Storm a protective hairstyle and giving her afro hair, you have 3 or 4 different silhouettes that her hair could take, as opposed to more traditionally straight European hair, which is always just kind of long and straight, right?
Yeah, and they can go in line with whatever power she's using at the time.
Yeah, totally. And you know, her hair, and I think it was a fantastic design choice.
Yes.
I just visually striking. I think it fit the character so fucking well. I think again, I agree with you. They didn't make enough use of her here, but I'm excited about her. Yeah, I'm excited about her in a way. And this comes back to what we were talking about last week, where I sort of said, I don't think they made enough bold choices in the Ultimate Universe. And then blam, the very next week, we see a fucking cool, bold choice that they made. And so I just want to celebrate that and just say, you know, actually, this is my moment to be like, Marvel, you did something good. Yeah. You did something really rad.
I want to see this character's origin. I know in the X-Men, her origin is obviously very similar. She, if I'm right in thinking, she grew up in Cairo, like on the streets of Cairo, and just happened to pickpocket a traveling Charles Xavier, who was like, "Oh, you're a bloody mutant! Like, I'm collecting you lot. Come over here."
Yeah.
But in this one, obviously, no Charles Xavier, as far as we know. So where did her life go? How is someone who grew up on the streets, like poorest of the poor, stealing to get by, suddenly develops the power of a god? And how that affects, you know, her trajectory. You know?
I think the effect of not having a Charles Xavier spreads the X-Men roster to the wind a little bit. Because he was that central force. Him and Magneto were the ones bringing them all together into a central location and saying, right, you are all the same, even though you're all very different. And without Charles Xavier, it's really reasonable to assume that the X-Men would all just be wherever the fuck they came from. Yeah. Doing whatever the fuck they were doing.
Which is exactly what we have seen so far, because we've got the Japanese characters in Ultimate X-Men. Yeah. We've got Storm here, like in the front lines of an African civil war.
Are we getting a Wolverine soon?
Apparently we are. We don't know anything
else. We talked about it,
didn't
we? We talked about it last week.
And at the extreme other level, we've got I can't remember their surnames, but it's Colossus and Magic. Yeah. Who are the heads of an entire continent, like the state, like they are like, apart from the Maker, they're like the top -1. So it's interesting that they are, as you say, spreading across from, you know, where they originated and how their lives have continued in that way.
Because isn't Colossus often depicted as being Eastern European?
Russian.
Yeah.
I think
that's a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah. I think he's just given like a generic Eastern European accent in some depictions. And I think that we just don't hear the difference as much.
I'm thinking mostly of him in Deadpool.
Yes, yeah. That's meant to be a Russian accent. Whether it's a good one or not, no idea.
I don't know enough about Russian accents.
Say.
Yeah, this is it. Like, I don't know. I always just assumed he was sort of Eastern European, but...
The one other kind of biggest area I think to talk about without getting to other specifics, one kind of example thing I thought was, I said earlier about the dialogue being a bit stilted in places.
It is a bit, isn't it?
But then my thinking was, I was like, this isn't the kind of setting that we can judge it. Like, oh, that's not how people would talk here, because we don't know how people would talk in Wakanda.
Exactly.
The best example scene for me of like, oh, this is where the dialogue works with, you know, the subtle undercurrent double meanings and stuff, is the fight between Okoye and Shuri, the queen and the sister of T'Challa. And they have this kind of underhanded double meaning where Shuri's still being polite to Okoye, but with that kind of backhanded line. Like, prime example, she comes out at one point to speak to her, and Shuri says, "Should I kneel for this? Or should I kneel for you?" And it's that really kind of like, I have to be respectful only because you're the queen kind of double meaning. So that was a kind of point for me where I was like, oh, this is where it works, because this is, again, we don't know how they speak. We're just being told this is how they speak, but there's still that emotional resonance with everything they say.
And it's interesting because there is a very specific variant of English that exists to lesser and greater degrees in different African countries, and it will sound different country to country. It's called Pidgin. So it's a Creole, which is essentially an amalgamation of a Creole is largely defined as an amalgamation of two different languages, and so you get this. It's really prominent in like Nigeria, where they speak English, and any Nigerian person you've probably ever met in your life has spoken fantastic English, but it's not an English-speaking country as such. And they have this sort of variant of English, which is essentially English, but merged with a bunch of, native and tribal languages and stuff like that. And it ends up being this really rich, colourful version of English. You get a little bit of it, weirdly, in Sex Education.
Right.
With Eric's character.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So he'll say stuff like, Jesus is Lord and I beg.
Yeah. It's when he says things that you can tell are kind of related to his family and his religion.
Yes.
And it's like that's how he just how he thinks of those sayings and phrases specifically.
Yeah.
He just equates them to his family saying them.
And so if the writers here had wanted to, there is a cultural tradition and a linguistic tradition they could have rooted this in.
Mm.
And I think that would have been quite interesting.
Do you think that'd be more difficult presenting over written text?
Oh, it would have been a nightmare.
Right.
And I can see why they went the route they did.
Yeah.
Because what we're seeing here, I think, is similar to the way that American media deals with like medieval British stuff, where they just make everything feel a bit stilted and a bit formal. And that kind of indicates that, we're in medieval Europe now.
Yeah.
My lord. Think Game of Thrones.
Oh, my lady.
Yeah. Think Game of Thrones, where you're seeing actually quite Americanized English at points, but presented in such a way that makes it feel like medieval, early modern English. And, it's a choice. As somebody who is just a fan of language, I would fucking love to see a comic book written in like a Creole pidgin. That would be so dope. But it would be largely impenetrable to a Western audience. And so I can see why they didn't use an actual African linguistic tradition to base the sort of, the dialogue on. But I just thought it was an interesting thing to bring up, that actually, these things do exist, and there are variants of English that are spoken on the African continent that would have actually given this a real feeling of authenticity that it maybe doesn't have.
Yeah.
But again, I can see why you wouldn't do that, because it would be really impenetrable to a Western audience.
I think this kind of dialogue I would equate to... I was thinking of describing it as Shakespearean, but I think that's not accurate enough to use. The way I describe it is fictional royalty, if that makes sense. It, like Game of Thrones is prime that. Like anything taking place in the main capital amongst royalty, it's this kind of English. It's very plain. I haven't got the words kind of enough to describe, but it's sounds fancy and posh, and it's very plain. It's no overuse of like difficult words or anything. It's that kind of thing.
Modern English, which has been ornamented in such a way that makes it feel a bit old time.
Yeah, it's old theatrical there's like a version of theater and plays that were done where it was this kind of speaking. So it was, people always associate with it like Streetcar Named Desire was like the first one where acting was done of like real people and not this presented version of English where everyone was prim and proper and talked like that,
Yeah, and again, the comparison you made of Shakespearean English is interesting. Shakespeare's English is an example of Jacobean.
Yeah, that's because it's real Shakespearean English is not that at all. That's why I didn't use it. But I think it's what people who don't know Shakespeare think Shakespeare is.
Yeah, and
Game of Thrones.
And I think the point that we're driving at, and I might be able to help you articulate the thing you're trying to articulate right now.
Please.
Is that what you see in Shakespeare? Let's take Shakespeare as the example. Shakespeare is Jacobean English, but it's highly ornamented Jacobean English. So it's Jacobean English that's been made poetic for the stage. So it's all in iambic pentameter, for instance, which is a poetic device. And 5 syllables, iambs. We all did fucking English at school.
Yeah.
And so it's a highly ornamented version of the Jacobean English that you would have heard on the street, right? And this is the same thing, isn't it? It's modern English, but elevated slightly in such a way that makes it feel a bit fancy and a bit royal and a bit old-timey. And it's a choice. You don't see it in all comic books. I think because the story itself is so rooted in these ideas of monarchy, it makes a certain degree of sense.
I would describe this as Shakespeare translated into plain English.
Well, I suppose.
That's the best way I'm trying to get it across. It's like high and prim and proper, prim and proper, but still, not how normal people, anyone in anywhere of the world actually really talks, except for royalty when they're in a meeting or on television, like that kind of thing. So moving past that, the other part I wanted to get across was the antagonists and explain that a little bit. that is the completely new aspect of this Black Panther version. So these two characters are Khonshu and Ra, ancient Egyptian gods, who personified in these human-appearing characters, claiming to be gods. Now, the reason they're relevant to the Marvel Universe is Khonshu, the Egyptian god of the moon, is actually a Marvel character as well.
Oh, really?
Who is the character who gives Moon Knight his powers and abilities and stuff. So Moon Knight is the kind of avatar of Khonshu, and is his fist of vengeance kind of thing in the real world.
And then because Ra's the one who would be depicted with a dog head, isn't he?
There's Anubis. I think Ra's like a bird of something, like an eagle or something like that.
But I know he's
the sun god.
He's the capricious one, isn't he?
Yeah. And
he's a bit of a bastard.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Egyptian gods were all a bit bastards to some degree.
Yeah. I don't know the Egyptian gods as well as I would like to. And again, potentially probably should have done a bit more research coming into this episode. Well, that feels like the Jamie portion of the episode where I'm like, oh, well, actually, Ra. I don't know much about Ra.
And to be fair to you, I don't think that any of that stuff is as important to these characters as is the fact that they are people who think they're gods.
Yeah.
And apparently seem to have the powers of gods, but then in the Marvel Universe, that's not really saying much. Because then it's like, well, is Hulk a god? Because he's pretty powerful. So I don't know if that rings true as much.
Yeah.
I do think there's a really interesting element here of gods versus kings. And they do hammer that point a lot. And there's a lot of flowery language with that. But what I do think the interesting aspect is, and I don't know if this is in the later issues that you got up to or not, but there's this point of winning the hearts and minds of the people.
Yeah, but I imagine that would have been the last two issues because I didn't see a whole lot of that.
So they do get into that a bit where it's like the Khonshu and Ra, them and their avatars are kind of like healing people and then being like, yes, just follow us and rebel against Wakanda. And then Black Panther's like saving people and he's like, don't believe the false prophets and, that kind of stuff. It does make an interesting point of like, it's not just a superhero fight between two super bad people. It might devolve into that. Yeah. But at this stage, at least, it's really like actually, again, winning over the people and that being like the main goal right now.
Yeah.
So there's something interesting there at least. But I thought it was interesting they used these other like Moon Knight adjacent like characters and mantles in this kind of way. I suppose it makes sense that they're not even like real characters in the main 616 universe. So the maker at some point must have been like, hey, you guys are gods. Do you want to rule this continent on Earth?
Do you want to come hang out?
Exactly. I do think it's really interesting to think that the maker didn't bother sabotaging Black Panther or Wakanda in any way.
I know, right?
And I guess his thinking was that, I'll just kind of engineer it so they just stay isolated in themselves.
Yeah.
And to be fair, that does relate back to Black Panther's origin in the comics, his publication origin, because his first appearance was in a Fantastic Four comic.
Really?
So the Fantastic Four go over there. He fights them
as an antagonist. Then
no, they go over there. I think they're invited, or they go over there because they think Doom's up to something there.
Yeah.
Black Panther attacks them. They fight for a bit, and then it turns when they kind of calm down. It's all superhero interactions are they fight for a bit and then they're mates. Weekly Planet podcast, but they. In this instance, he's like, oh, I fought you guys because I'm about to fight this other guy who's a real bad guy. And I was kind of testing my mettle against the famous Fantastic Four.
Right,
kind of thing.
Okay.
So it's like, all right, bit weak excuse, but all right, whatever. But I think what's interesting here is we know the Fantastic Four aren't what they are, basically don't exist as far as we know here. So it makes sense that Wakanda has remained in isolation.
Yes.
Because this was their contact in the main comics.
That's a nice touch, isn't it?
And it's also interesting to think that these gods, again, are Egyptian gods. So it seems like maybe Egypt has slowly been taking over the continent of Africa.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not, given where Egypt was, it's not implausible, is it? Like, do you know, Egypt is so old that...
Cleopatra, there's the reference of her to now versus the ancient pyramids.
Yeah, the pyramids... There is more time between the pyramids and Cleopatra than there is between Cleopatra and the first iPhone.
Yeah, they were...
fucking mental.
Yeah, they were ancient to her.
Yeah, like the sphinxes we see are the second iterations because they went to ruin and were rebuilt.
Yeah.
How fucking rad is that? That society lasted for so long.
Yeah, it's crazy. Just goes to show all empires fall, and maybe
they do.
Maybe closer these days. Who knows?
Oh, don't. while you and I are just clinging to a rapidly declining country that we live in.
Yeah, don't think about it. Just read comics. Like, that's the key.
I think that's everything to talk about this one.
Yeah, pretty much. The only other thing I was going to say about that is that I like how the idea that they were like, don't interfere with the rest of the continent. We'll deal with ourselves. It's like, they've literally surrounded you and invaded. They are surrounding you now. You kind of have to deal with it now. And it does then maybe play into later that kind of idea of like, maybe if we'd intervened earlier, we wouldn't be dealing with this massive force that's completely surrounded us now. Like, I think that's an interesting point there. But yeah, I think those are the broad strokes. There's a lot of smaller stuff. There's a lot of stuff with vibranium and a new element and all that stuff, which is a bit super shenanigans. I think mileage may vary on that.
It's essentially the plot of Iron Man 2.
A little bit, yeah. And there's a whole thing about like, oh, it's the elemental opposite of vibranium. I'm like, you don't need to do any of that. Like, I don't know.
The less said about that, the better.
Yeah.
Overall, though,
interesting. It's probably the highest accolade I could pay it.
Yeah. Overall, I think if you are looking for a good Black Panther comic, probably do a bit more research and look elsewhere.
Yep.
If you are getting into the Ultimate Universe, this slots in really nicely and is not bad by any degree, and introduces some really fun, interesting characters that I think are going to play a big part in the Ultimate Universe to come.
Yeah.
So I think it's a nice addition. And again, you know, one of the things that I'm starting to notice about this Ultimate Universe stuff is that because they are creating, you know, this whole new universe and they're rebooting things and everything's sort of slotting together, actually, even if stuff isn't stellar, it plays a part. And so, you know, I think in a year or two, once we've had an opportunity to look at a lot more titles from it, we'll actually be able to do a retrospective episode on the Ultimate Universe.
Oh, yeah.
And just sort of, you know, once we've maybe had a chance to look at least most of the titles, if not all of the actual content, we'll be able to look back at it and say, what do we think of it as a whole? Because they are driving towards a whole here, aren't they?
Yeah. And I think what's good about it compared to the main... compared to the main Marvel universe is main Marvel universe is mostly in New York.
Yeah.
This, I like that you've got this big main title that's kind of takes place everywhere. But then you've got Spider-Man in New York, Ultimate X-Men in Japan, this in continent of Africa.
Yeah.
So I like that it's already feeling like it's building up an entire world that this is taking place in. So we're seeing it from really different aspects, but it all filters back to the maker and the council and the rewriting of history and all that. So I like that everything tangentially kind of connects back to all that stuff. But yeah, interesting, and I would like to see where it goes, more so the large universe than this specific title, but you know, I'll dip back into this maybe and see how it's gone. But
so,
yeah.
I have some bits I'd like to talk about.
Yeah? Is this things you've read or consumed?
No, this is something that popped up on my phone.
Okay, yeah.
And I did send you an image of it. There is one of our TikToks that is still being consumed for a reason that I mean, it's a good one.
Bone claws?
It's the bone claws one, yeah. And consistently...
Bone claws are the best claws.
Bone claws are the best claws. And consistently, it still gets...
That's got to be a t-shirt.
Consistently, it still gets views and likes. So every once in a while, I'll open my phone and it'll just be a list of people that have liked that TikTok. And I always like to see that. But today, bear in mind, like, I work in an office. I'm not looking at my phone much. I opened my phone at lunchtime and there it was. Thanos liked your TikTok. And that just really amused me. So,
do we know if it is the Thanos?
Well, this is the thing. I don't know. I checked out their TikTok. They're not making content. So if you are the user whose TikTok handle is Thanos, thank you. You gave me a chuckle. But this feeds into something wider for me, which is that initially was not one of our most popular shorts.
I mean, on TikTok, I don't know the exact figures.
No, but it's indeed.
Yeah.
Like it's one that the algorithm is still serving to people. It's an old piece of content now. That piece of content must be a year old, which in TikTok terms is fucking ancient.
Yeah, there's to peek behind the curtain a little bit. One thing we did kind of learn is that TikTok tends to just, if something good does well, it just continues to recommend it and serve it. YouTube tends to cut things off after a certain time.
Yeah.
But within our level of, engagement, interaction, probably things that get to millions probably are repeatedly served. But it's a stark difference between YouTube and TikTok.
But stuff that's hitting the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands, it'll get to a certain point and be like, right, we think that this piece of content has lived its life now, and we're just going to stop serving it to people.
I think it's more just, I think YouTube has more, for some reason, they've focused more on like new stuff and getting new creators off the ground, which has worked very well for me, like in a short span.
Hasn't it just?
And I think that is a thing they're doing, because I'm seeing recommendations on my, on the videos recommended on the right-hand side of you, wherever you're watching. I see a lot more sub 100 view videos and stuff being recommended. So I think they're trying to get new stuff out. And obviously that naturally means that stuff will get recommended for a time and then just cut off. TikTok, they're just like, keep seeing if this people want to see this.
Yeah.
Like it works last year. Let's keep doing it, yeah?
In terms of things I've been reading, I finished the sequel to the Satsuma Complex.
Ah, yes, by one Robert Mortimer.
By one Bobbert Mortimer, yes. The Hotel Avocado. It was good. It gets a thumbs up. It gets a would recommend. Not as good as the first one.
That's fair.
Yeah, but it was a good, and it kind of, the characters that you liked from it continued to explore them in fun ways, and the story wraps up quite nicely. It's good. The thing that I've been reading that is totally captivating me at the moment is Vagabond still.
Well, the manga you've already spoke on.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. Honestly, mate, it keeps getting better. And the other thing about it is it's so historically informed. When I was a teenager, I went through a phase of reading Tokugawa era, so like 15th century samurai treatises. So books written by samurai in the 15th century. Notably, the Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi, who is the protagonist of Vagabond. And then The Life-Giving Sword, written by Yagyu Munenori, who is the son of the invincible samurai that Musashi meets in the comic.
Right.
And it's
in the
manga, yeah. And then also The Art of War and stuff like that. And it's kind of triggered me to start rereading those things that I read 20 years ago when I was a teen. Well, not 20 years ago, but when I was a teenager. Yes. Nearly 20 years ago. Fuck. And so that's been a really fun, interesting time. I've just been sort of delving into Tokugawa era Japanese history and reading a lot of Vagabond. And I think we have to.
I mean, yeah, we can cover it a bit.
I think one of the things that I really want to do is an experiment in actually delving a bit deeper into a comic and talking about the whole of Vagabond. The issue is it's a 300 issue comic.
Yeah, it's gonna take some time.
Which hasn't finished and probably isn't going to finish. It's been indefinitely on hiatus for years now. And I wanted to get your thoughts about it on air as to how feasible you think it is for us to delve that deeply into something that big.
I think it would have to be in parts, and I think that would be beneficial to it, because I think if you, we only do these for like hour and a half, you probably won't get everything into something that's many issues. Whereas, I mean, we put it this way, we're doing a test run with a 100th episode.
Have you started?
I've not started yet, no.
I have.
Okay, that's good.
It's honestly, mate, oh my God. It's as good the second time round.
I cannot wait. I'm actually genuinely excited to get into it. But that'll be a good test run for, that nearly 70 issues of that. So, we'll see how that goes. But I think if something's long enough, then as expanding as Vagabond is, then episode parts would probably do it more justice.
Yeah.
And to just be easier to make, easier to consume. So I think that would be the best route to go down for that. Okay. But I'm more than up for more ambitious, titles in that kind of regard.
It's interesting because I think, to get a bit meta about the podcast on the podcast, I have been the limiting factor in terms of the scope of things that we can tackle because I'm busy.
Yeah, life is life,
Yeah. And so it's sort of, I know it's a bit rich of me to be like, I want you to read 300 issues of something where I only managed 7 of something this week.
Yeah.
But it's also... And again, this is a conversation that you and I have had a lot off air about how much of stuff we read and how much of a snapshot we get of things before we form opinions about them and shout those opinions into the void, right?
Yeah.
And there is something to be said for a first impression, and there is something to be said for, I think, giving our audience the opportunity to have a detailed discussion about 4 issues under their belt and then deciding to read the subsequent 4 issues of something that exists, for instance. And then there's also something to be said of, I've read 300 issues of this. I've lived with it for 3 months. It's been the only thing I've been reading. I need to tell you about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we could do an episode where you tell me all about it.
Well, I mean, I think the Vagabond episode would be that.
Yeah.
It would be a very Jamie talky history episode. I would probably have to give you a little bit of insight into the Tokugawa era of Japanese history and how it functioned and what it was like.
See, and this is why I think it would have to be in parts.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind, like, a key example I always think of in terms of like parts of an episode is one of my favorite podcast experiences, listening to
Was
ones.
it The Lonely Planet?
No, that is a good one. It's a really good one. But Lonely Island? You say Lonely Planet?
Yeah.
What's that?
What's the podcast you always listen to? The
Weekly Planet.
Weekly Planet.
I'm also listening to the Lonely Island podcast as well, and that's why I was confused.
What? Andy Samberg?
Yeah, and Akiva and Yorma and Seth Meyers for some reason.
They have a podcast?
Yeah, they're going through weekly. They're going through their all the stuff the Lonely Island have made, starting with the
Saturday
SNL
Night
digital
Live
shorts.
sketches. Yeah.
But yeah, so one of my best experiences was listening to, and it sounds kind of macabre, especially with current news, but it's the Behind the Bastards episodes about Vince McMahon, obviously wrestling connection, everything. What's interesting about that is they do episodes about some of the most evil people in history, like Hitler, Genghis Khan, Elon Musk, and those episodes.
you knew what you were doing there.
He has episodes, but those episodes are two-parters, right? I can't remember if I probably told you this before, whether you remember or not. Guess how many episodes that Vince McMahon...
It was like 6, wasn't it?
6 hour-plus episodes.
How did I remember the exact number?
It's a significant number.
My memory's weird, bro.
And then, but as a key example, the first episode, they don't even get to Vince McMahon specifically. They go through the history of pro wrestling. Because obviously a lot of their listeners don't know pro wrestling.
Yeah.
So it was the fact that they had done all this research into Vince McMahon, they also done research into why is pro wrestling a thing? How did it start? Like, why is it like it is today? So that was their first episode, an hour was just that. And then they get into Vince McMahon. So if you've got all this like ancillary knowledge about historical Japan and stuff, then that's going to require potentially a separate episode with the beginning of Vagabond maybe in that part. You know?
I think what we're saying here, guys, is that if you want better, more detailed episodes, Ryan and I need more time, which means you need to share the podcast to all of your friends and make advertisers aware that we are available so that we can dedicate a bit more time to this.
Tell your friends and family, you need to listen to this so they can do more obscure, in-depth titles.
Does that count as the call to action for this week? I think it does.
I mean, theoretically, I might propose that you tell people to leave reviews on certain apps and that catches 5-star ideally. And then also just checking us out on the YouTubes and TikToks like you mentioned earlier, especially my own channel, Comic Stand, where may or may not be another video. Who knows? Life gets in the way
is
and
it
all
coming?
that. It's going to happen eventually.
I've seen that one, haven't I?
No. Part of it, maybe part of it.
I've seen most of it, I think, at this point.
I haven't made most of it yet.
Oh, have you not?
Yeah, definitely not. But yeah, that's the only information that's the only recommendation I would make to your call to action.
Because I'm really into the idea of a cold ending these days.
The problem with the cold ending is I like to know when it's done so I can turn off. And I say that as the person who edited a previous episode with many fake endings to fuck with the listeners. But yeah, generally I prefer a finite ending.
That makes sense.
Thank you. Goodbye.